July 2, 1943. The skies above Sicily were boiling with war. The air smelled of engine oil, gunpowder, and sun-baked metal. First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall squinted against the glare of the Mediterranean sun as his P-40 Warhawk roared over the enemy airfield at Castelvetrano. He spotted movement below, two Focke-Wulf 190s climbing hard, their silver wings flashing. They were fast, deadly, and confident. But they never saw him coming. Hall pushed his throttle to the stop, dived out of the sun, and squeezed the trigger. The machine guns thundered. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky, ripping into the German fighter's fuselage. Smoke poured from the enemy's engine as it spiraled downward into the Sicilian countryside. Hall pulled out of his dive, heart pounding. He had just achieved what the Luftwaffe believed to be impossible. A black American pilot had shot down one of Germany's most feared fighters. The airfield erupted when Hall landed. Mechanics, armorers, and ground crewmen, men who had endured months of whispered insults and mocking stares, gathered around the bullet-riddled Warhawk. A fresh swastika was painted beneath its cockpit, marking the first aerial victory by a black American pilot in U.S. military history. That single symbol carried the weight of generations. What began as a segregated experiment was now rewriting history in gunfire and courage. Back in Germany, where Nazi ideology labeled black people as Untermensch, subhuman and incapable of complex thought or bravery, the news would travel slowly but sting deeply. Somewhere, a Luftwaffe commander would soon realize that the men they'd laughed at were rewriting the mathematics of war. But this victory didn't begin in the skies of Sicily. It began years earlier, in classrooms that refused to teach them, in schools that wouldn't admit them, in a country that demanded their loyalty but doubted their worth. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College published a report claiming that African Americans lacked the intelligence and courage for technical or leadership roles. It stated bluntly that the Negro soldier was of inferior mentality. These words, typed on government paper, carried the weight of policy. They were used to deny opportunities, to justify exclusion, to chain ambition. Yet while those reports gathered dust, a quiet revolution was already taking flight. Eugene Bullard, an American who couldn't fly for his own country, had fought for France in World War I and earned his wings there. Bessie Coleman, denied entry to every American flight school, crossed the Atlantic to earn her license in France. Their stories lit sparks in the hearts of young black Americans who refused to accept no as the final word. By the late 1930s, schools like the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago were proving that skill in the air had nothing to do with the color of one's skin. Dozens of black civilian pilots graduated, flying over open fields, dreaming of something their nation still wouldn't allow. But the clouds of war were gathering. Europe was burning and the United States needed pilots, lots of them. Civil rights leaders like Walter White, A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie saw an opportunity to strike at the walls of segregation. They pressed, petitioned, and protested. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier demanded a simple answer from Washington. How could America fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? Their persistence paid off barely. In 1939, a law was passed requiring that at least one flight training program include black students. It was a token gesture wrapped in segregation, but it cracked the door open. When President Franklin Roosevelt sought re-election in 1940, he needed the support of black voters in northern cities. Political pressure met military necessity, and in January 1941, the U.S. War Department announced the creation of an all-black flying unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Even that announcement came with an insult. The squadron, the statement said, would be an experiment to test whether black men were capable of flying in combat. They were not expected to succeed, but among those selected was a man who understood exactly what was at stake, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of the first black general in the U.S. Army. At West Point, Davis had spent 4 years in near total silence. His white classmates refused to speak to him except for official duties. That isolation forged something unbreakable in him. When he took command of the 99th, he knew this unit carried more than its own fate. It carried the reputation of millions. The men arrived at Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the segregated South, where they were to train in both flying and survival. Locals mocked them. The Army kept them separate from white cadets. The message was clear. You're not wanted here. But they endured. They studied harder, trained longer, and flew more hours than any white unit in the program. They were not just training to be pilots. They were training to prove a lie wrong. When they finally reached North Africa in 1943, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, they were handed outdated P-40 Warhawks, planes already obsolete against the sleek German Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Their commanding officer, Colonel William Momier, doubted them from the start. He kept them on patrol duty away from major combat, waiting for them to fail. But they didn't. Their first missions were cautious, escorting bombers, patrolling the Mediterranean. Then came June 2, 1943, their first real taste of battle. German fighters appeared suddenly, slicing through the sky. The Tuskegee pilots held formation, refused to panic, and protected every bomber under their guard. Not a single American plane was lost. It wasn't glory, but it was proof. They could fight and they could win. 1 month later, Charles Hall's victory sealed that truth in history. The experiment had succeeded. The inferior mentality had just bested Germany's best. And from that day forward, the world would start to learn the name that the Luftwaffe would whisper with wary respect. The Black Birdmen, the Schwarze Vogelmenschen. But this was only the beginning. The battle for recognition would soon become fiercer than any dogfight over the Mediterranean. Because the greatest enemy the Tuskegee Airmen would ever face was not in the sky, it was on the ground, in the hearts and minds of those who refused to see them as equals. By late 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron had earned its place in the war, but not its respect. Colonel Momier, their commanding officer, still doubted them. To him, discipline and success meant whiteness. Every Tuskegee pilot who returned from mission, every aircraft that came home intact was met with silence instead of praise. When Momier filed his official report, it was devastating. He wrote that the squadron lacked aggressiveness and recommended their removal from combat duty. In other words, he wanted the experiment to end. The paper trail made its way up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Arnold prepared to shut the entire program down. The words "unsuitable for combat" echoed across the corridors of Washington. For the men of the 99th, the dream they'd fought so hard to build was about to die. Not in battle, but in bureaucracy. Then history intervened. January 27, 1944. The coastal town of Anzio, Italy, burned under the weight of German bombs. The Allied invasion had met fierce resistance. The Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of fighters against American positions. The 99th Fighter Squadron, flying old, battered P-40 Warhawks, was scrambled into the inferno. 15 pilots climbed into the freezing morning air, their engines coughing smoke, their radios crackling. Ahead of them, dozens of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts screamed toward the beaches. Captain Charles Hall led the charge. "Keep your formations tight," he barked. They climbed into the sun, then dove straight through a wall of enemy aircraft. Gunfire erupted, tracers carved through the clouds. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. When the sky cleared, the impossible had happened. The 99th had downed multiple enemy aircraft, between 8 and 13 depending on whose report you read. Hall added 2 more kills to his record. The Germans scattered. Back at base, silence fell as the pilots landed one by one. Mechanics stared at the bullet holes, at the smoke still curling from their exhausts. They had done it. The so-called experiment had just turned the tide of an air battle. The War Department ordered an investigation comparing the 99th's performance with white squadrons. The conclusion stunned everyone. The 99th performed as well or better than other P-40 units. Hap Arnold tore up the cancellation order. The experiment was no longer in question. It was proof. For Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the victory at Anzio was more than tactical. It was personal. He had watched his men carry the weight of prejudice into every sortie, fighting not just the Luftwaffe, but the doubts of their own commanders. Now at last the numbers spoke louder than skin color. The 99th had done what they were never supposed to do. They had won. In May 1944, the Army Air Forces took the next step. The 99th was merged with 3 new squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. Their mission was clear: escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Their new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, was faster, sleeker, deadlier. It was the plane every pilot dreamed of flying. At Ramatelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, Davis assembled his men beneath the rising sun. "Our job is not to be aces," he told them. "Our job is to bring the bombers home." It wasn't a request. It was a commandment. While other fighter groups chased personal glory, the Red Tails would measure their worth by the safety of others. The order to paint their aircraft came soon after. General Nathan Twining wanted every fighter group easily identifiable from the ground. The 392nd received red, bright, defiant, unforgettable. The mechanics painted entire tail sections crimson, the propeller spinners and nose bands matching. The color gleamed against the silver fuselage, visible for miles. To the bomber crews above Germany, that flash of red would soon become a symbol of hope. Their first long-range escort missions began in June 1944. The bombers they guarded flew over the most dangerous airspace in Europe: Vienna, Munich, Budapest, Berlin. German radar stations tracked them from takeoff. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs launched from hidden bases, waiting to tear through the formation. For bomber crews, survival often depended on who flew above them. Many had learned the hard way that some escort groups broke off to chase fighters, leaving the bombers exposed. But not the Red Tails. They stayed. They flew tight, disciplined formations that wrapped the bombers like a shield. When enemy aircraft appeared, they intercepted fast, hit hard, and returned to their post. They didn't wander, didn't chase kills, didn't break rank, and word began to spread among the bomber groups. "Request the Red Tails if you can get them," became the quiet mantra of pilots and gunners. By midsummer, their reputation stretched across the entire 15th Air Force. Yet for the men of the 392nd, each mission was a test of endurance. They flew farther than anyone, over mountains, over flak-filled skies, through freezing winds at 25,000 feet. They watched bombers explode, heard desperate calls over the radio, and sometimes couldn't help. Their courage wasn't in pulling the trigger, it was in staying. Then came July 18, 1944. Colonel Davis led 66 P-51 Mustangs toward Germany. Their target, the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen. But the bombers they were to protect were late, vulnerable, alone. Davis made a decision few commanders would dare: hold position in enemy airspace until the bombers arrived. It was suicide, but retreat was not an option. When the formation finally appeared, so did the enemy. Nearly 100 German fighters fell upon them. The sky turned into chaos: smoke trails, fireballs, spiraling aircraft. The Red Tails fought like lions, claiming over a dozen kills but losing 3 of their own. Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Brown. 15 bombers fell, torn apart by flak and cannon fire. Critics back home would later say this proved black pilots couldn't handle major engagements. But after the smoke cleared, military analysts uncovered the truth. The Red Tails had arrived late to an ambush already in progress. Their actions had saved dozens of bombers that would otherwise have been destroyed. For the men of the 332nd, heroism wasn't about headlines. It was about duty, about flying back through shattered skies with holes in their wings and frost on their oxygen masks, knowing they had done what no one expected them to do. That summer, the Germans began to notice. Reports from Luftwaffe pilots described a new kind of enemy: disciplined, precise, unrelenting. They called them Schwarze-Vogelmenschen, the Blackbird Men. To Nazi ideology, it made no sense. Black pilots weren't supposed to exist, let alone excel. But the evidence kept falling from the sky. Burning Messerschmitts and smoking Focke-Wulfs littered across Europe. Every red-tailed Mustang that returned to base carried more than bullet holes. It carried proof. Proof that courage had no color, and that hatred, when tested against skill and resolve, would always lose altitude. But the greatest test of all was yet to come. The Germans had one weapon left that could change everything: a machine faster than anything the world had ever seen. And soon the Red Tails would have to face it head-on. Winter 1944. The air over Europe had changed. Allied bombers now struck deep into Germany, hitting oil refineries, rail hubs, and aircraft factories. But something new had appeared in the skies, something that moved faster than anything the Red Tails had ever seen. The first time they saw it, Lieutenant Charles Brantley thought it was a falling star. A silver blur streaked past his canopy, climbed straight up, and vanished into the clouds. Seconds later, a bomber behind him exploded into a ball of fire. The radio came alive with panic. What was that? Someone shouted. But nobody had an answer. Within weeks, intelligence reports confirmed it. The Germans had unleashed their secret weapon, the Messerschmitt Mai 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Its twin engines gave it a speed advantage of nearly 200 miles per hour over the Red Tails Mustangs. Against such speed, even skill and discipline might not be enough. At Ramitelli Airfield, the mood was tense. Pilots gathered around maps, tracing routes with trembling fingers. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood before them, calm as ever. "We don't panic," he said. "We adapt." His voice carried the weight of a man who had faced down prejudice his whole life. He knew what it meant to fight against impossible odds. Their orders were clear. Continue escorting bombers no matter what the Germans brought to the fight. The 332nd couldn't afford failure, not now. Not after everything they had proven. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve. While much of Europe lay buried in snow and silence, the Red Tails were airborne. Their mission: protect B-17 flying fortresses heading toward oil targets in southern Germany. Halfway through the flight, radar picked up movement. Dozens of contacts, high and fast. "The jets were coming. Stay tight," Davis called over the radio. "They'll try to pick us off one by one." The Mi-262s dove through the bomber formation like meteors, their cannons spitting shells the size of fists. Two B-17s burst apart instantly, their wings torn away. The Red Tails broke formation, chasing the jets in desperate pursuit. But the enemy was gone before they could line up a shot. Then came a flash of silver. Captain Roscoe Brown spotted one climbing too sharply, its engines glowing red. He pushed his Mustang into a steep dive, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. He waited for just the right moment, then fired. A burst of .50 caliber tracers tore through the jet's tail. The Mi-262 exploded mid-air, scattering debris across the clouds. Brown's calm voice cut through the radio. "Got him." That kill would become one of the first jet victories by any American pilot in history, and it belonged to the Red Tails. But victory came at a price. Lieutenant Richard W. Smith was shot down the same day, bailing out over enemy territory. He was captured and spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp. For weeks, the squadron flew with his name stenciled on the side of an empty cot in their tent. As 1945 began, the 332nd Fighter Group was flying more missions than ever. Their Mustangs were pushed to their limits. Long-range escorts from Italy to Berlin and back, often 9 hours round trip. The engines froze at altitude. Oxygen masks iced over and exhaustion was constant. Yet day after day, the Red Tails took off. By February, they were being requested by bomber groups across the front. Crews began painting small red tails on their own planes for good luck. To the men flying those heavy bombers, the sight of crimson Mustangs overhead meant one thing: home. On March 24, 1945, the Red Tails received their most dangerous mission yet: Operation Varsity, the largest airborne assault of the war. The objective was to protect more than 1,000 C-47 transport planes carrying paratroopers across the Rhine River into Germany. At dawn, the sky was filled with aircraft, miles of silver wings glinting in the rising sun. The Red Tails formed a tight screen around them. Then out of nowhere, the Luftwaffe attacked. Dozens of FW-190s and Mi-109s burst from the clouds. The air became a hurricane of bullets and tracer fire. Captain Edward Toppins, one of the Red Tails' most experienced pilots, dove head-on into the enemy formation. Break right," he shouted, pulling the trigger until his guns jammed. He clipped a wing, spiraled out, and disappeared into smoke. His Mustang never returned. When the battle ended, the transports had crossed safely. Over 30 German aircraft were destroyed, but 4 Red Tails were missing. Back at Ramitelli, their bunks were left untouched, flight gear still hanging beside the doors. No one spoke during dinner that night. Still, the mission was hailed as a triumph. The Red Tails had proven once again that they were not just equal, they were exceptional. As spring approached, the war in Europe began to collapse. American and British forces raced toward Berlin. Rumors spread that the Luftwaffe was finished, that Germany had nothing left to fight with. But the Red Tails knew better. The most desperate battles often come just before the end. On April 26th, they flew what would be their final escort mission of the war. 60 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17s to attack an airfield near Prague. The bombers released their payloads without loss. As they turned home, a formation of Me-262s appeared, fast, silent, deadly. Davis himself gave the order. Engage. In the chaos that followed, the Red Tails shot down 3 jets and forced the rest to flee. Not a single bomber was lost. When they landed hours later, the airfield erupted in applause. Mechanics hugged pilots, commanders saluted subordinates. For the first time, victory didn't feel borrowed, it felt earned. The statistics told the story. In over 200 escort missions, the Red Tails had one of the lowest bomber loss rates of any fighter group in the entire war. Their record stood as proof that discipline and unity could defeat even the most advanced weapons. As the war drew to its close, the pilots of the 382nd stood on the tarmac watching the sunset over Italy. The sound of engines fading into the distance was all that remained of the greatest test they would ever face. But deep down, they knew their fight wasn't truly over. The battlefield might have been Europe, but the war they had started, the war for equality, for dignity, for recognition, was still waiting for them back home. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The guns fell silent. The skies that once burned with tracer fire now carried only the hum of peace. Across airfields from England to Italy, fighter squadrons celebrated victory. Flags were raised, champagne bottles popped open, cameras flashed. At Ramitelli there was no cheering. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group gathered quietly around their planes, staring out at the horizon. For years they had been called an experiment. For years they had been told what they could not do. Now the very same Air Force that had doubted them stood on their shoulders to claim victory. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. walked the flight line, his boots crunching on the gravel. Mechanics saluted. Pilots stood at attention beside their red-tailed Mustangs. Davis said nothing for a long moment. Then he simply nodded and said, "We did our job. Let's go home." Their journey back across the Atlantic was not the triumphant return they imagined. There were no parades waiting, no medals pinned on the runway. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to a country still divided by color. In Europe, they had fought Nazis. In America, they faced segregation. At military bases, they were ordered to use colored facilities. White officers who had never seen combat looked down on them. Some restaurants near their bases refused to serve them. The same men who had risked their lives over Germany now had to fight to sit at a lunch counter. For many, it was a cruel irony. They had proven themselves in the most unforgiving theater of war. They had fought not only for freedom abroad, but for the right to belong at home. Yet when they landed in Alabama or Georgia, they were reminded that some battles can't be won with bullets. Still, their legacy refused to fade. The numbers told the truth the world could not ignore. Over 15,000 sorties flown. More than 250 enemy aircraft destroyed, hundreds of bombers saved, and one of the lowest bomber loss rates in all of World War II. But beyond the statistics was something greater. A record of discipline, unity, and dignity that no one could erase. When the 332nd Fighter Group was officially deactivated in 1946, the men walked away with their heads high. Some left the service and went back to school. Others stayed and became part of something even larger. In 1948, just 3 years after the war, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. Historians would later agree that order would never have been possible without the Tuskegee Airmen. They had proven in combat that equality was not a theory, it was fact. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. went on to become the first black general in the United States Air Force. The same man who once had to eat alone at West Point now commanded thousands of men. His quiet resolve had outlasted every insult, every doubt, every closed door. For others, the war left ghosts that never went away. Some of the Red Tails never returned from missions. Their names were carved on small wooden crosses in Italian soil. Men like Edward Toppins, Robert Hutton, and Richard Smith. Pilots who gave everything for a country that didn't yet know how to thank them. Years later, bomber crews who had flown under their protection began to tell their stories. They spoke of the red tails that appeared when things looked hopeless, of the radio crackle that meant salvation was near. Some said they owed their lives to men they had never met. When you saw those red tails, one veteran said, you knew you were going home. In the decades that followed, the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen grew. Their story spread through books, documentaries, and classrooms. Young cadets learned their names. Pilots painted red stripes on their aircraft in tribute. In 2007, more than 60 years after their first missions, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were invited to Washington, D.C. They sat in wheelchairs and dress uniforms, their medals shining beneath wrinkled hands. When the president entered the room, every man in the crowd rose to his feet, not out of habit but out of pride. The applause went on for minutes. Some of the old pilots wept, not because they wanted recognition, but because finally, the world was ready to hear what they had been saying all along, that courage has no color. Today, the red tails live on, not just in history books but in every pilot who dreams of the sky, in every soldier who fights for something larger than himself, and in every person who refuses to let prejudice decide their limits. At the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, one of their P-51 Mustangs stands on display. Its tail gleams bright crimson under the museum lights. Visitors walk past it, reading the small plaque below. They fought 2 wars, one against fascism abroad and one against racism at home. They won them both. The sound of an old propeller engine plays through hidden speakers. Children look up at the red tail and whisper to their parents, "Did they really fly this?" And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint echo of a calm voice saying, "We did our job." The red tails were never meant to be heroes. They were meant to fail, to prove a point that America was never ready to face. But instead, they rewrote the point entirely. From the dusty airfields of Alabama to the frozen skies over Berlin, they carried more than bombs or bullets. They carried the weight of history. And they delivered it, safely, home. When the sun set over Ramitelli for the last time, the hangar stood empty, and the wind moved gently through the abandoned runways. But if you stood there long enough, you could still see them, silver wings, red tails, and the contrails of men who refused to be grounded. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just change the war, they changed the sky itself.